The night it happened, Cale Dorian had been doing nothing more heroic than fixing a broken water pump. He was elbow-deep in the irrigation housing at the edge of his family's land when the sky above the Vethara basin cracked open with a sound like a mountain splitting. He didn't look up immediately. The pump had been fighting him for 2 hours, and he had the wrench finally seated on the coupling, and he was not going to let 3 hours of work come apart because something interesting was happening in the atmosphere. But when the second crack came, low and concussive, reverberating in his chest rather than his ears, something in the quality of it made him look. A vessel was coming down wrong. He'd seen atmospheric entries before. Supply barges out of Cathara Station made the run twice a month, trailing their usual orange contrails in a long, graceful arc that faded over the eastern ridge. This was not that. This was a ship, sleek and silver-dark with hull geometry he didn't recognize, and it was rotating on an axis it shouldn't have been rotating on, one side shedding a bright trail of burning debris and the other catching the planet's thin upper atmosphere in stutters of blue-white friction. It was not gliding, it was falling. Cale dropped the wrench. He was already moving toward the utility runner before the ship disappeared behind the ridgeline, already calculating which track would get him closest to the projected impact zone. The Vethara Basin was remote by any measure. Nearest settlement was Hark's Crossing, 40 kilometers north, with maybe a doctor if you were lucky and a trauma kit at the general supply if you weren't. But the ridge behind his land opened onto a flat, pale salt flat that was the only stretch of level ground for 20 kilometers in any direction. And if a pilot had any survival instinct and any control at all, that was where they'd aim. He hit the track going faster than was strictly safe, the runner rattling over the packed earth ruts he'd carved into the land over 3 years of back-and-forth work. The stars were coming through on the eastern horizon, hard and white, and the air had the dry, mineral smell it always had at dusk, the salt coming up from the flat below mixed with the cooling earth of the ridge. He'd driven this track hundreds of times. He had it in his hands and his feet, and he pushed the runner to the limit of what it could handle on the ruts without shaking itself apart. When he crested the ridge and the salt flat spread below him in the early dark, lit by the last of the evening light and the still cooling glow of something recently hot, he saw the ship. It had made the flat just barely. It had come down at an angle that would have killed anyone not strapped in, the nose tearing a long furrow through the salt crust before the vessel slewed sideways and came to rest against the only rocks on the flat, a scatter of low volcanic outcroppings that had probably saved its nose from burying and flipping. There was smoke rising from the port side, controlled smoke, not the rolling black of a fuel fire, and a section of the ventral hull was glowing an ugly amber that told him the cooling systems were working hard against something that had gotten very hot very recently. He got the runner down the ridge track and onto the salt flat and drove to within 30 meters before he stopped. Ship that hot, he didn't know enough about alien engineering to know where the safe distance was. The salt crust crunched under the runner's tires and settled, and then the flat was quiet, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic ticking of metal contracting as the ship began to cool. He waited. For about 90 seconds, nothing moved. Then a panel on the side hull, not a standard airlock, he noted, more of an emergency egress plate, recessed into the hull and blown outward by internal pressure, opened with a hiss and a clatter of released atmosphere, and something came out of the ship. He didn't register her scale immediately, because she came out crouched and stumbling, catching herself against the hull before she straightened, and when she straightened, Cale's brain needed a moment to recalibrate. She was tall. Not tall the way a person could be tall, not the kind of tall you noticed and then stopped noticing. She was a full meter taller than him, and he was not a short man, and she was built in the long, spare proportions of something that had evolved under lower gravity. Limbs slightly too long for a human aesthetic, fingers fractionally more than human, neck a little more elegant, spine carrying an uprightness that looked less like posture and more like architecture. Like her body had simply decided this was the correct shape for a vertical being, and had committed to it completely. Her skin was a deep blue-gray, the color of a still lake in overcast light, and it caught the amber glow from the cooling hull in a way that made it look briefly lit from within. Her hair, and it was hair mostly, though it moved in a way that suggested it had some awareness of air currents he couldn't feel, was white-silver and cut short on one side, longer on the other, sweeping across her jaw, and there was a streak of something dark in it near the temple that might have been dried blood. Her eyes found him immediately. They were pale gold, almost luminous in the fading light, and they were full of pain she was very clearly refusing to let translate into weakness. She had one hand pressed to her left side, low under the ribcage, and even at 30 meters Cale could see that the hand and the fabric beneath it were dark with something that wasn't salt or smoke. She said something in a language he didn't know. Her voice was low and slightly resonant, the kind of voice that would carry in a large hall without strain, and whatever she'd said had the clipped, falling shape of a warning, the universal sound of someone establishing a boundary before any boundary had been tested. "I'm not armed," Cale said and held both hands up, palms out. "I'm a settler. I live back over that ridge. I heard your ship come down." She watched him for a long moment. Her jaw was set. She said something else, a different cadence this time, shorter, with a rising shape at the end, and it might have been a question, or it might have been her own kind of assessment. "I don't understand you," he said, "but I can see you're hurt. I have a kid in the runner. I'm going to walk to the runner and get it. I'm not going to come toward you. I'll put it on the ground halfway between us, and you can come to it if you want." He didn't know how much of that she understood. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible to the back of the runner. He opened the cargo hatch, the familiar smell of dust and oil and the rubber seals of the kit, and took out the trauma kit and the emergency thermal blanket he kept for the nights when the ridge track broke an axle and left you stranded until morning. He walked out to roughly the halfway point between them, crouched, set both items on the salt crust, and stepped back. She watched him do all of this. The flat was quiet except for the ship ticking and cooling behind her. The first proper stars were through now, hard points of light in a sky going from blue to purple to dark. The air smelled of scorched metal from the ship, and under that, the clean cold of the salt, a smell that had no equivalent anywhere he'd lived before this place. Then, with the controlled gait of someone refusing to let pain dictate the manner of their movement, she walked to where he'd set the kit, crouched, which brought her to roughly his eye level, and looked at it. She looked back at him. "Sealing foam is the orange canister," he said, pointing. "If the wound is open, that's the fastest way to stop it losing anything. The scanner, the flat blue one, will give you a readout on internal damage. I calibrated it last month." He paused. "I know you can't understand me. I'm talking so you can hear there's no threat in my voice. People's voices tell you things even when the words don't." She held his gaze for a moment that went on long enough to feel like a decision being made at some depth, not quickly. Then she opened the kit. She did not, he noticed, use the orange canister on herself. She used the scanner, running it over her own torso with the efficiency of someone who had used medical equipment before and knew what she was looking for, and whatever the readout told her made her expression tighten briefly, a fractional thing, the muscles at the corners of her jaw, before she set it down. Then she picked up the sealing foam, studied the canister, found what were apparently the instructions on the underside, and applied it to the wound under her palm without so much as a sharp breath. That, Cale thought, was either extraordinary pain tolerance or extraordinary training. Possibly both, and possibly the kind of person for whom the distinction had never mattered because the result was the same either way. When she was done, she looked at the thermal blanket, looked at him, and said something that had the rhythm of a question. "It's for warmth," he said. Temperature drops fast out here after dark. The planet wasn't built for either of us." He wasn't sure why he'd said that last part. It wasn't a line he'd prepared, it had just come out. It seemed to land, though. She tilted her head, a very small motion, and something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the very first degree of recalibration. The adjustment you make when something you expected to be indifferent turns out to be, fractionally, not. She took the thermal blanket. He gave her space. He sat on the back of the runner with a thermos of the strong dark tea he always brought on late repair runs, and he watched the distant orange glow of her cooling ship, and he did not push. She moved around the vessel for a while, checking things, running what he assumed were damage assessments, her tall figure moving in and out of the amber light in a way that was occasionally eerie and occasionally, when the light caught her just right, something entirely different from eerie. She was methodical. She worked inward from the perimeter, and she didn't skip sections, and she took her time. Occasionally, she looked over at him. He raised the thermos when she did. He didn't wave, didn't call out. Just raised the thermos the way you'd acknowledge someone who'd asked if you were still there. She didn't walk away, which he decided to count as a good sign. After about an hour, she came and sat on the salt flat 5 meters from the runner. She'd wrapped the thermal blanket around herself in a way that left her arms free. She'd figured out the snap clasps quickly. He noticed, better than some humans he'd lent it to, and she was looking at the stars with an expression he recognized in the general shape of it, even if the specifics were beyond him. It was the expression of someone who had expected to be somewhere by now and was reckoning with the fact that they would not be. Professional grief. The particular adjustment that happens when a plan you were confident in ceases to be operative. He found the translator device in the glove box of the runner. It was a basic unit, built for the trade negotiations that happened occasionally along the frontier routes, not sophisticated, not designed for nuance, but functional enough for practical communication with maybe 40 registered species languages at varying degrees of accuracy. He held it up so she could see it. "Translator," he said, "I don't know if your language is in it, but I can try." He spoke a few words into it, and the device ran through its pattern matching, cycling through possible linguistic architectures, making tentative identifications based on phoneme groupings. It landed on something and played back a phrase that was clearly a rough approximation. He could see it in her reaction, the slight narrowing of her eyes, but approximation was better than nothing. Her head had turned sharply at the first sound of her language. She said one word, short and clipped, and the device parsed it as a confirmation. Yes, this matches, continue. The dialect it had found was apparently something like the archaic version of hers, or a regional variant, because her expression suggested it was slightly off in a way that was more amusing than obstructive, like hearing your language rendered by someone who had learned it from a very old book. "My name is Cale Dorian," he said, letting the device render it. "I'm a settler. I own the land on the other side of that ridge. You're on a salt flat nobody claims. You can stay as long as you need." The device rendered it. She listened. "Vale," she said. "My designation in your phonetic pattern is Velitha Sorn." A pause while the device caught up to her cadence. "I am," the translation is imprecise, "a traveling officer of the third watch. I was carrying documents between 2 stations when my ship's navigation system was damaged by debris from a collision event in the upper system. I did not make my destination." "Are you injured badly?" "The wound is sealed. I have a secondary injury to the muscle structure beneath my left shoulder that will limit my range of movement for several rotations of your planet. I do not believe there is internal bleeding." She said this with the same flat efficiency with which she'd applied the sealing foam, the matter-of-fact accounting of someone who had learned to file their own damage reports rather than feel them. "Your medical equipment is well calibrated." "It's basic, but I keep it current. Out here you're your own trauma bay." He paused. "Can you contact your people?" Her expression shifted. My communication array was damaged in the impact. I transmitted a distress signal before landing, but I cannot confirm it was received or by whom. My people will eventually locate me, but eventually is not an immediately actionable timeline. He looked at her. She was sitting with the good posture that seemed to be structural rather than disciplined, the thermal blanket around her shoulders, the pale gold of her eyes steady in the dark. The salt flats stretched out behind her white and silent, and the cooling ship glowed faintly amber at her back. "You can come back to my house," he said. "I have a room. I have food. I don't know what you eat, but I have a variety and we can figure out what doesn't poison you." He paused. "You don't have to. You can stay with the ship if you'd rather. I can bring you supplies out here." She looked at him for a long time. In the dark, with the flat stretching pale around them and the stars fully through now, her eyes caught the starlight in a way that was genuinely otherworldly, not unsettling, but entirely, completely not human. Something about her gaze had a depth to it that made him feel slightly like he was being read rather than looked at. Not coldly, not that, but precisely. "You do not know me," she said finally, the device working between them. "You owe me nothing. You have provided me with medical equipment and warmth. Why would you also offer your home?" He considered that for a moment. It seemed to him like a question that deserved a real answer, rather than a reflex. "Because you're hurt, you're stranded. The temperature's going to drop another 15 degrees by midnight, and your ship isn't a safe place to sleep in its current state," he said. "Those seem like reasons enough." She was quiet. "Among my people," she said eventually, "the acceptance of hospitality creates obligation. I would not wish to bind you without your knowledge." "I appreciate the warning," he said. "But in my understanding, helping someone who's stranded isn't a transaction. You don't owe me anything for a room and a meal." Another long pause. "Your planet," she said, "has an unusual ethical architecture." "Most people just call it basic decency," he said. "But sure." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, not anything he had a precise name for, but a relaxation around the corners of her eyes, and the set of her jaw that felt like the first moment of genuine ease he'd seen from her since she'd climbed out of the ship. The first moment where she wasn't actively managing her circumstances, just sitting in them. "I will accept your hospitality," she said. "Cale Dorian." The farmhouse was not built for someone of her height, and he'd known this when he offered. He told her so as they came in, pointing out the doorframe she'd need to duck through and the ceiling height in the main room, which gave her maybe 15 centimeters of clearance. She ducked and straightened with the equanimity of someone who had navigated spaces not built for her before, looked around the room with those luminous eyes moving from surface to surface, and said, "It is warm. That is the relevant factor." He fed her trial and error, which was the only honest approach, setting out what he had in small quantities, letting her examine each thing with what appeared to be a scent assessment followed by a tactile one, watching which things she pushed back and which she was cautiously willing to try. The process took time, but she was patient with it, and so was he. She could eat about half of what he had. The grain-based things worked. Most of the vegetables worked, the root ones better than the leafy ones, which she set aside after a single assessment. The preserved protein blocks he kept for long work stretches worked, somewhat to his surprise. The fermented dairy was a firm and immediate no. She ate carefully and she ate enough, and when she was done, she sat with the translator between them on the table, and she was quiet in a way that wasn't unfriendly. It was the quiet of someone who was very tired and was choosing not to spend energy she didn't have on performance. The translator sat between them like an arrangement they'd both agreed to, and he didn't fill the silence with noise just to fill it. The kitchen was warm from the stove. Outside, the temperature had dropped the 15 degrees he'd predicted, and the wind off the ridge had come up. He could hear it in the eaves, the familiar low note it made when it found the gap above the western window frame that he kept meaning to seal. The house had been his for 3 years and he still hadn't sealed it. He'd come to think of it as a feature. "You should sleep," he said eventually. "I have repairs to assess in the morning. The ship isn't going anywhere tonight. Sleep first." She looked at him over the translator. "You give directives easily." "I give suggestions easily," he said. "You can do what you like." "That distinction," she said, "is also interesting." He showed her the spare room. It had a wide, low bed he'd built for the occasional friend passing through, wide enough for 2 humans, which meant it was wide enough for her to sleep on diagonally, which was not elegant but was functional. He brought her extra blankets, 3 of them, because the translator had given him the sense she came from a climate that ran warmer than the basin, and he showed her where the washing room was, and he left her alone. He went to his own room and lay in the dark and thought about the silver ship cooling on the salt flat, and the woman with pale gold eyes who was sleeping under his roof, and he didn't feel afraid or uncomfortable or complicated about any of it. He felt mostly the specific quiet satisfaction of having done something useful. She'd needed help. He'd had it to give. The world was full of more complicated arrangements than this, and he had no desire for one tonight. He was asleep in minutes. She was up before he was. He found her in the kitchen, standing at the window with the first gray light of morning coming pale and flat through the glass, drinking water from the pitcher he'd left out. She'd cleaned the dried blood from her hair. It was back to its proper silver white, the long sweep of it brushing her jaw on the right side, and she was holding herself with better ease than the night before. Still careful, still precise in how she distributed her weight to favor the shoulder injury, but the acute pain was clearly less present. She moved through the kitchen, as though she'd been in it longer than a single night. "The ship," she said when she heard him. "I need to assess the damage in daylight. After you eat something." She turned to look at him, and there was a faint, dry quality to the look that he was beginning to recognize as her version of very mild exasperation. "You are insistent for a civilian," she said. "I'm practical," he said. "You can't assess anything useful if you're running on empty. It'll take 15 minutes. She ate. He noticed over those 15 minutes that she was beginning to understand the rhythm of his kitchen. She knew where the cups were. She'd found the covered grain he kept ready to cook. She'd located the small ceramic spoon he preferred and set it beside the pot without being shown. She'd been awake longer than just since he'd come in, and she'd used the time to map the space. He found this not invasive but simply characteristic. She was a methodical person. Of course she'd cataloged the kitchen while she waited. They went to the ship together after. In daylight, the damage was clearer and worse than she'd perhaps hoped. The navigation array was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. A whole section of the port hull simply gone in what looked like a debris impact that had come in at a shallow angle and punched clean through. The communication array was physically present, but showed burn patterns along the primary interface connections that meant it wouldn't transmit without repair. The landing struts on the port side had collapsed on impact, visible now in the daylight as a series of buckled shafts that had bent outward and taken a portion of the lower hull plating with them, which was why the ship listed at that angle, tilted like a question mark, and would need to be either replaced or rigged carefully for a controlled liftoff that didn't worsen the imbalance. She walked the whole vessel with a thorough precision, occasionally crouching to look beneath, occasionally pressing her palm flat against a section of hull as though she could feel the ship's condition through it. He followed at a respectful distance, occasionally handing her a tool from the kit he'd brought along out of instinct, and her expression was the controlled, measuring look of someone doing a professional damage assessment, and not allowing themselves yet to feel the full weight of what the assessment was telling them. The salt flat in daylight was a different place from the salt flat at night, white and vast under a pale sky, the outcroppings of volcanic rock casting short shadows in the low morning light, the wind working across it in small visible currents that raised fine white dust and set it down again. It was empty in a way that felt complete rather than lonely. The sky was enormous. She stood at the portside impact site for a long time. "Can you fix it?" he asked, when she'd come back around to the egress plate. "Not here," she said. "Not without equipment I do not have and cannot fabricate in your facility. The communication array I can repair. There are components with compatible architecture, though they will require adaptation. Navigation I cannot address without specialized hardware." She paused. "The communication array is the priority. I need to confirm my distress signal was received and by whom." The settlement 40 kilometers north, Hark's Crossing, has a general supply depot. It's a frontier outpost, not a technical facility, but it's been there long enough to have accumulated components from a lot of different sources. "I can drive you there today or tomorrow." "Today," she said, and then, "if that is possible without inconveniencing your work." "The pump will wait," he said. She gave him that look again, the slight adjustment around the eyes that he'd started to recognize as the expression she made when something landed differently than she'd expected. He was beginning to read her, or beginning to think he was, which wasn't quite the same thing but felt like something. The drive to Hark's Crossing took 40 minutes on the northern track, better maintained than the ridge track and easier on the runner. She sat in the passenger seat with her long legs folded at an angle that looked architectural. She'd found a way to make the space work without complaint, just adjusted, the way she seemed to adjust to most constraints, and she looked out the window at the basin as they drove. The Vethara Basin was mostly flat, and mostly pale, and mostly sky. The settlements were few, and the distances between them were real. The rock formations to the east caught the morning sun in shades of amber and red, and the dust on the track was fine and white behind them. "Your planet is quiet," she said. "Most of it, this part especially." "You chose this part." "I did. Where you came from, it was not quiet." "Not particularly." He paused. "Cities are full of noise that isn't sound." After a while, I needed to be able to think without the interference. "It translates perfectly," she said, and something in her voice had a quality he hadn't expected, the quality of someone recognizing a thing they felt themselves. "I know exactly what you mean." He glanced at her. She was looking out at the basin, and her expression was, for just a moment, unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. He looked back at the track and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and the silence between them was, for the first time, simply comfortable. Hark's Crossing was not much to look at. It was a strip of practical buildings around a central supply depot and a fuel point, the kind of settlement that existed because someone had once needed fuel and supplies at this particular coordinate, and other people had followed. The structures were low and functional, built to survive the basin winds rather than to please the eye, and the road through the center was packed earth that held its shape and nothing else. The population was around 200, settlers and passing traders, a small maintenance crew for the relay station on the hill above town, and the doctor who was sometimes there and sometimes not. Velitha drew looks. He'd expected this. He tried to warn her during the drive, had said something about how his people hadn't had much contact with hers in this part of the system, and she might attract attention. And she'd looked at him with an expression that suggested she had navigated being conspicuous in unfamiliar places before, and had developed a settled relationship with it. He believed her. She walked through Hark's Crossing at her full height, unhurried, looking at things with those pale gold eyes, and carrying herself with the ease of someone entirely at home, in their own skin regardless of whether anyone else was comfortable with it. The looks she drew were mostly the kind born of startlement rather than hostility, people stopping mid-task, nudging each other, the kind of response that was less judgment than simple recalibration. A few children stopped entirely, staring with the unfiltered fascination of the very young, and Velitha looked at them with something that was not warmth exactly, but was the absence of dismissal, which in his experience was how a certain kind of person chose to receive open curiosity from small people. He went to the supply depot and explained what he needed. The manager, a broad-faced woman named Dorthan who had been running the depot for 15 years and was not easily impressed, looked at Velitha and then looked at Kale and said, "Secondary storage. I've got components back there I haven't cataloged in 3 years. Might be something that matches what you're looking for." What they found was not perfect matches. Nothing in Dorthan's secondary storage had ever been sorted for alien navigation compatibility. But Velitha moved through the shelving with a focused patience, picking up components, turning them in those long fingers, holding them up to the light, and examining the internal architecture where it was visible. "This will require an adapter I can fabricate," she said of one. "This gauge is incompatible, but the crystal architecture beneath it is correct," she said of another. "This one I do not know, but the configuration is interesting." She found enough. Dorthan watched the whole process from the doorway of the secondary storage with the expression of someone reassessing several assumptions simultaneously. And when they'd loaded the components into the runner, she said to Kale, very quietly, "Is she going to be all right?" "I think so," he said. "She knows what she's doing." Dorthan looked at Velitha, who was organizing the components in the cargo bed with the same methodical care she'd brought to everything. "That's obvious," Dorthan said, and went back inside. When they loaded the last component, Velitha said, "This will take me 2 or 3 days to repair, assuming the adapter fabrication proceeds without error." "You can stay," he said. "I told you that. You told me for a night. I meant for as long as you needed." She looked at him over the roof of the runner. "Kale Dorian," she said through the translator, "I do not know your custom well enough to understand whether you are simply very generous or whether you are building obligation." "Neither," he said. "I have a spare room and you need a place to work. It's not complicated." She seemed to turn this over, not doubting it, he thought, but taking the measure of it, finding where to put it in her accounting of the world. "Among my people," she said, "the simplest explanations are frequently the least accurate." "Among mine," he said, "they usually are." She got in the runner. He took that as agreement. The next 2 days had a rhythm he found, to his mild surprise, entirely natural. She worked on the ship in the mornings, beginning at first light and working through until the heat of midday drove her inside. He worked on his own repairs in parallel. The pump, a section of irrigation pipe along the east field that had been losing pressure for 2 weeks, a run of fence line along the border of his land where something large had tested the wire. They crossed paths at the ship and at the house, sometimes in passing and sometimes for longer, and they talked through the translator in the halting but increasingly precise way of 2 people learning each other's cadences, finding where the device's vocabulary was adequate and where it wasn't and building workarounds for the gaps. The device got better at her dialect as it logged more samples. She got better at his. He noticed her beginning to anticipate the rhythm of his sentences before the translation came through, nodding or tilting her head at the right moments, responding to tone as much as content. He learned things about her in pieces, the way you learn things about anyone when there's work to do, and the conversation happens around it rather than being the point of it. She was methodical in the way of someone who had been trained to be, but underneath the method there was a dry, quick intelligence that occasionally surfaced as something close to humor. Not jokes exactly, but observations that had a particular angle to them, a quality of noticing the gap between how things presented themselves and what they actually were. She had strong opinions about engineering that she expressed with the confidence of someone who had been correct about engineering many times and knew it. She was careful with objects, not precious about them, but attentive. She handled everything he handed her with a specific, focused care that he eventually recognized as respect for things that had been made. She could be absolutely still when she chose to be. She slept more than he'd expected, and he understood eventually that she was healing, that the muscle injury she dismissed in her initial damage report was more significant than she'd let on, and that sleep was her body's argument for more time than her discipline wanted to give it. He did not ask about her home. She would tell him what she wanted to tell him. On the second night, she told him some of it anyway. They were sitting outside after dark. She'd said something about finding the open sky easier to be under than a ceiling when she was tired, and he understood this in a planetary sense, even if he didn't share her specific relationship to it. And she was looking up at the stars with an expression that was, tonight, less professionally grieved and more something quieter. The basin was entirely dark around them. The only light was the stars and the faint orange residue still coming from the port side of her ship, cooling slowly, and the lamp he'd set on the step of the farmhouse door behind them. "I have a home world," she said. "Vethara is," she paused, seeming to check the translation, "several transit days from here at standard speed. The stations I travel between are a trade route I have been assigned for 2 cycles." "Do you like it?" he asked. "The route?" She considered this with the seriousness she gave to most questions. "It is useful," she said. "It provides me with purpose and income and the company of others, like is perhaps too personal a measure for work." "It can be both." She looked at him. "You like your work here?" "Most days," he said. "Some days the pump is winning and I don't like anything, but generally, yes." "It is very solitary," she said. Not as a criticism, she said it the way she said most things, as an observation she was placing on the table and inviting a response to, rather than a judgment she'd already made. "By choice," he said. "I was in a city for a while, I'm better out here." She nodded. She seemed to understand this without needing it explained further, which was, he thought, more than most people managed. Most people asked why. She simply accepted it as a completed fact about him and moved on. "Your ship," she said after a while. "Not the runner, the metaphorical one. Do you not worry about," the translator is imprecise here, "about missing the connections you left behind?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "but I can think out here. There's something about the sky and the land and the work that makes the important things feel like what they are. Back in the city, everything had the same urgency. Out here, the urgency belongs to the right things." She was quiet, looking up. "I did not expect," she said finally, "to find this place peaceful." He looked at her. She was looking up at the stars, and her expression was not professional or guarded or in pain. It was simply open. The pale gold of her eyes was soft in the dark, and the wind off the ridge had died for the evening, and the stars above the basin were enormous and thick. "You can come back," he said. "If the route ever brings you near this system, the room's always there." She looked at him then, and he couldn't fully read what was in her expression, but he thought it was something he hadn't seen from her before, something soft and genuine and slightly undone. Not vulnerable in a way that had fear in it, just real in a way she hadn't been quite yet. "You say things," she said, "as if they are not extraordinary." "They're not," he said, "they're just true." She looked back at the stars. He looked at them too. The basin was entirely dark and entirely quiet, and the sky above them was enormous and full of light, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and it was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The repair was done midway through the 3rd day. He helped where he could, mostly holding things, handing things, being told precisely what was wrong with his guess at which component she'd wanted next in a tone that managed to be informative rather than unkind, which he appreciated. The adapter she'd fabricated from the incompatible components fit on the 3rd attempt, and she held it up and looked at it with the expression of someone whose engineering has just confirmed a theory and said, very quietly, something in her language that the translator rendered as yes, that's it. The communication array came together in sections. She worked from the inside out, re-establishing the interface connections first and then the transmission hardware, testing each layer before proceeding to the next. When she ran the activation sequence, and the display inside the egress hatch lit up in a cascade of her language's script, she let out a breath that was the first fully unguarded sound he'd heard from her. Not a word, not something through the translator, just a breath released from a 3-day tension. "It is functional," she said. "Good." She ran a transmission check. The array reached out. A response came back. She read it. Standing in the hatch of her tilted ship with the afternoon light coming across the salt flat, and her expression did something complicated that went through several stages before settling into a controlled neutrality that told him the news was significant. "My distress signal was received," she said slowly. "I have a response from my home system." "That's good," he said. She looked at him. The relevant word is perhaps overseer or guardian, or the person responsible for my travel itinerary and my safety. He has been searching for me for 3 days. A pause. He is a concerned person. Regarding my welfare. He'll be relieved you're all right. He will be more than relieved. She seemed to be searching for a word or a construction the translator wasn't giving her. He is the person whose responsibility I am, and whose responsibility I have been since before I was assigned to this route, and he takes that responsibility intensely. She paused again, and there was something in her expression he couldn't fully parse. He will want to know who aided me. "You can tell him you found a helpful settler," Cale said. "That's accurate." She looked at him with an expression he'd learned to read as him having misunderstood something important. "Cale Dorian," she said, "I should tell you something." She told him. He sat on a rock near the ship and he listened, and the translator worked hard to give him the shape of what she was saying, and the shape of it was something he hadn't fully accounted for. Vilitha Sorn was not a traveling officer of the Third Watch in the sense he'd understood it. She was a traveling officer in the sense that it was the role she'd been assigned for purposes of what the translator offered alternately as discretion and incognito, which were very different words in his language, and he suspected the truth was somewhere between them, a concept his language didn't have a clean word for. The role was official. The rank was real. What was not entirely accurate was the part where he'd assumed it was an ordinary appointment given to an ordinary traveler. Her father was Sovereign Varath Sorn III of the Sorn Dominion, which governed roughly a third of the inhabited systems in this region of the galaxy. She was his youngest daughter, and, in the organizational hierarchy of the Dominion's ruling family, the third in a succession order that was largely ceremonial but entirely real in the sense that it shaped every room she entered and every exchange she had. She had been traveling the trade route under a protocol the translator called something like legitimate anonymity, which her people had developed because their royals being recognized during routine travel had a reliable tendency to create incidents, complications, and the specific misery of every interaction being shaped by who you were rather than what you were doing. She'd had no intention of telling him, not from deception, she explained carefully, but because in her experience, people who knew behaved differently. The way they spoke changed. The way they looked at her changed. The help they offered shifted from being about the situation to being about her, and she'd stopped being able to tell what was genuine and what was strategic, and she'd learned to value anonymity the way other people valued warmth. The 5 days of being helped by a man who didn't know and didn't need to know had been, the translator offered rare, and then offered genuine, and she seemed to accept both. "You are not angry," she observed. "Should I be?" he said. "Many people would feel they had been deceived." He thought about this. "You told me your name," he said finally. "You told me you were hurt, and you told me what your ship needed, and you told me what you could eat. Everything that mattered for me being able to help you, you were straight with me." A pause. "Who your father is, that's not mine to know unless you wanted to tell me." She was quiet for a long moment. "You are," she said, "a very unusual man." "I'm a pretty ordinary settler," he said. "I think you've been in very complicated company for a long time." Something crossed her face, an expression that was rueful and genuine, and briefly, fully unguarded, the expression of someone recognizing a true thing about themselves that they'd been carrying without naming it. "Yes," she said. "I think that may be accurate." Her father arrived on the 5th day. Cale knew it was coming because she'd told him. The response message had contained an itinerary, and she'd relayed it to him with the neutral tone she used for information she wasn't sure how he'd receive. He'd said okay, and he'd made sure the house was clean, and he'd thought briefly about what it meant to have a sovereign arrive on his salt flat, and then he'd gone to finish the irrigation work because the pipe wasn't going to wait for his philosophical processing. He was out at the Eastfield Pipe Junction, the repair finally done and running its first proper pressure test, when the ship came through the atmosphere. It was nothing like the ship he'd watched fall from the sky 5 days ago. This one came down correctly, an enormous vessel, the color of deep water hull geometry that was clearly related to Velitha's ship, but scaled up by a factor that suggested a very different kind of budget. It moved with the deliberate poise of something that had made this kind of descent 1,000 times and saw no reason to perform haste. It was maybe 10 times the size of her ship. It came to rest at the edge of the salt flat, not in the same place, a polite distance from her damaged vessel, with a precision that spoke of navigational systems that hadn't been recently destroyed by space debris. A ramp descended. Cale walked out from behind the pump housing, wiped his hands on his work cloth, and watched. The man who came down the ramp first was not what he'd expected, and then, looking at him, was exactly what he'd expected. He was tall, not as tall as Velitha, but significantly taller than Cale, with the same blue-gray skin and the same long proportions and the same pale gold eyes. He was older, with the silver of age worn into his temples, and he carried himself with a stillness so complete it managed to read as force, not the performed stillness of someone demonstrating composure, but the settled stillness of someone who had been exactly this certain of their own ground for a very long time and no longer needed to demonstrate anything about it. He was dressed in something dark and formal that was not armor and not robes, and was somehow both. Behind him came perhaps 100 people, and Cale did not look at them because he was engaged in the more pressing task of holding the gaze of the man in front. Velitha came down the ramp right behind him. She was at her father's shoulder almost immediately, saying something to him in their language, quick and quiet, not urgent, the cadence of someone providing context and assessment, and the sovereign listened with his eyes on Cale, and when she finished his expression, which had been the same careful, reading expression she'd inherited directly, shifted slightly. He looked from Cale to his daughter and back. They crossed the salt flat together. Cale had decided he would not do anything unusual. He stood where he was and he waited, and when they were close enough he said, through his translator, "I'm Cale Dorian. Welcome to my land." Vareth Sorn III looked at him for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was very controlled and very resonant, and carried the weight of someone who had been giving words weight for a very long time, "My daughter has told me what you did." "I found her ship on the salt flat," Cale said. "I had a trauma kit." "You gave her medical aid, shelter, food, and transportation to acquire components for her repairs," the sovereign said, "for 5 days, without knowing who she was, and you asked for nothing." "There wasn't anything to ask for," Cale said. "She needed help and I had it." Vareth Sorn looked at him for another long moment. The 100 people behind him did not move. The salt flat was white and silent around them, the sky enormous above. Then he looked at his daughter. She was watching Cale with an expression he'd seen before, the open, genuine, slightly undone expression she'd had on the second night under the stars. She wasn't trying to hide it from her father. She was just looking at Cale the way she'd looked at the stars that night, openly, because she'd decided it was all right too. Her father looked back at Cale. In my experience, the sovereign said, and his voice had shifted slightly, still formal, still carrying its weight, but something in it had opened a fraction, which is extensive and not always flattering to the character of those who deal with my house. Men who do what you did fall into a small and specific category. They are either very simple, very calculating, or genuinely decent. He paused. My daughter's judgment, regarding which you are, I have learned to trust. She is not often wrong. She's sharp, Cale said. I figured that out in about 20 minutes. Something happened in Vareth Sorn's expression. The careful, reading expression loosened, just briefly, into something that might have been the same not-quite smile he'd been watching develop in his daughter for 5 days. It was gone quickly, but it had been there. I have come to offer a reward, the sovereign said. Cale opened his mouth. Before you decline, Vareth said, and there was something dry in his tone that was unmistakably his daughter's quality appearing in its source. I would ask that you listen to what the reward is. Cale closed his mouth. My daughter has explained the nature of your situation here, Vareth said. A land holding on a frontier world, limited infrastructure, isolation from markets and supply chains that would benefit you. What I am offering is not money, because I suspect you would find money uncomfortable. A pause. I am offering a trade agreement. Between your settlement, Hark's Crossing, she informs me, and the Sorn Dominion's trade network. Supply access at Dominion rates. Market connection for whatever your settlers produce. And a communication relay installed on your hill, which would connect your settlement to the broader network and give you access to emergency response times that are currently, I am told, several hours longer than is acceptable for a permanent settlement. Cale was quiet. That is not for me, he said slowly. That's for the whole settlement. Yes, Vareth said. That is what makes it an appropriate reward. You are not a man who wants things for himself. The reward should be for the people around you. A pause, and something in his expression that was not quite approval but was the specific look of someone who has been correct about a person. This is my judgment. You may still decline it. Cale looked at him. He looked at Velitha, who was watching him with those pale gold eyes, steady and direct. The relay would mean emergency response in under an hour, he said. Under 40 minutes, Vareth said, from the nearest Dominion response station. He thought about Dorthan, who'd been running the settlement supply logistics for 15 years with chains that didn't fit the need. He thought about the doctor who was sometimes there and sometimes not, and the 40-kilometer drive to nowhere useful when someone was badly hurt. He thought about the relay station on the hill above Hark's Crossing, decades old and doing its best, and not being quite enough. Then yes, he said, thank you on behalf of Hark's Crossing. Vareth nodded once. The nod of a man who had expected this answer. Then unexpectedly, he stepped forward and extended his hand. Cale looked at it. He looked up at the sovereign's face. My daughter tells me, Vareth said quietly, that on your planet this gesture means something. It means we have an agreement, Cale said, and that we see each other as equals. He took the hand and shook it. Vareth's grip was firm and dry and entirely serious. His hand was the same blue-gray as his daughter's, the same long proportions, and it was warm in the way of someone running a slightly different internal temperature than a human baseline. I believe, the sovereign said, that is an accurate summary. The relay installation took most of a day. The team from the ship were efficient in the particular way of people who did large technical projects regularly and at scale, and Cale stayed mostly out of the way and let them work. Vareth spent a portion of the afternoon in the settlement at Hark's Crossing, where Dorthan had driven out when the enormous ship appeared on the horizon, and was now receiving a detailed briefing on the trade agreement terms with the expression of a woman who had stopped expecting good luck years ago, and was renegotiating that position in real time. Cale could hear her voice from 30 meters away when they ran her the supply rate structure, though he couldn't make out the words. Velitha found him at the pump. He was running a final test on the coupling. It was holding. the pressure steady and even the way it was supposed to be, and when he straightened up she was standing at the edge of the housing, watching him. Her arms were loosely folded. The afternoon light was behind her and her hair caught it at the edges, silver white and warm. "You are still fixing the pump," she said. "It needed fixing. The sovereign of the Sorn Dominion is standing 40 meters from you, overseeing the installation of a communication relay on your planet, and you are fixing a pump." "The pump was broken before he got here," Kale said. "It'll be broken after he leaves if I don't fix it." She shook her head, which was, he'd learned, her equivalent of a quiet laugh, not the performance of amusement but the real thing kept small. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "properly, not through my father's arrangement, which is appropriate and correct and is his way of expressing what he cannot entirely say in direct terms. I wanted," she paused, choosing words carefully, not hiding behind the precision but finding it. "What you gave me was not supplies and a room. What you gave me was 5 days of being treated as a person whose name was enough, who did not have to be anything else to be worth help." She looked at him steadily, and there was nothing performed in it. "I do not always have that." He didn't say anything for a moment. The pump was running smooth below them. The voices from the relay installation carried faintly on the wind. "That's how it should be," he said finally, "for everyone." "Yes," she said, "but it is not always how it is. And the fact that you did not know who I was, it matters, Kale. It means I know it was real." He looked at her. The afternoon light was gold and flat across the salt flat, and she was very tall and very still, and her eyes were the color of first light, and she was looking at him in a way that was, he didn't have a word for it, something open and particular and entirely itself. "You're always going to wonder," he said, "if people are responding to you or responding to your father." "Not always," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "Not about everyone." He felt the weight of that. He didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know what it meant, but because it deserved the respect of being given room. "Will you come back?" he said. "The route, does it bring you near this system?" "It can," she said. "Routes can be adjusted." "Then come back," he said. "When you want to, the room's always there." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I will take the room," she said. "And I will bring components for your pump, which is clearly not going to stop requiring repair." "That," he said, "is the most practical acceptance of an invitation I've ever received." She looked at him with the expression open, genuine, slightly undone, and this time she didn't pull it back into composure. She just let it be there, steady and real in the afternoon light on the salt flat. "Among my people," she said, "the second acceptance of hospitality is not obligation. It is, the translator will not give me the exact word. It means a thing chosen, not owed, wanted, not required." He understood. "Among mine," he said, "it just means you're welcome." They left in the late afternoon. The enormous ship lifted off the salt flat in the unhurried way of something that had all the time in the universe and knew it, rising in a slow, controlled arc that scattered white salt dust outward in a perfect ring, and then settled it back down as the ship climbed above the reach of its own displacement. Kale stood and watched it go, hands in his pockets, the dust settling around his boots, and when the ship was high enough to be a bright point against the blue, it caught the angle of the sun and flared briefly, completely, like a star deciding to be noticed. He watched it until he couldn't see it anymore. Dorothy pulled up beside him in her own runner. "Communication relay is tested and live," she said. "Trade agreement terms are signed. I've been running supply logistics for 15 years and I've never seen terms like that." She paused. "Kale, what did you do?" "She crash-landed on my salt flat," he said. "I had a trauma kit." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a woman who had dealt with understated people before and had limited patience for it. "You are," she said, "the most frustratingly understated person on this planet." Probably, he agreed. She left, shaking her head, and he stood on the salt flat for a while longer in the quiet. The evening was coming in from the east, the sky going from blue to amber above the ridge. The volcanic outcroppings threw their long shadows across the white crust. Velitha's damaged ship sat at its angle, the port side still tilted, now with a temporary locking brace installed by her father's crew so it wouldn't settle further before she could return with proper replacement struts. Her crew hadn't done the repairs without her permission. She'd said she'd be back. Roots can be adjusted. He went back to the farmhouse. He made tea. He sat at the table where she'd eaten 5 nights running, and he looked out the window at the early dark coming over the ridge. He thought about pale gold eyes and the way she said his name through the translator, steady and clear, like a word she'd decided to use again. He thought about a route that could be adjusted. He thought about the second acceptance of hospitality, a thing chosen, not owed. Wanted, not required. He thought about the way she'd looked under the stars that second night, open and unguarded in the dark, saying she hadn't expected this place to be peaceful, and the way it had felt like something being true rather than something being said. The tea was good. The house was warm. Outside, the relay on the hill above Hark's Crossing blinked green for the first time. He could just see the edge of its light from the window, a faint, regular pulse against the darkening sky, patient and steady, already reaching out into the space between stars. He finished his tea. He went to bed. And in the morning, when the basin was quiet and the light was coming gray and flat over the ridge, he went out to the pump and checked the coupling one more time, and it held. End.